I'm Joel McCower, talking about what will it take to make aviation sustainable with Alexis Bateman, director of the MIT Sustainable Supply Chain Lab. Hey, Alexis. So let's talk about aviation, sustainability, and supply chains. Tell us about how those three and where those three intersect.
When you look at the whole system of things, air does have very high emissions impact, but it also carries really high value items, despite only carrying a very small proportion of the goods. So looking at those three factors, we kind of land on the criticality of aviation in supply chains. So there won't be sort of a reduction of that use. And in fact, during COVID, the need to air freight goods went way up because of the urgency for certain materials to arrive in a very short amount of time. Most clear and relevant and current example would be pharmaceuticals, in particular, high imperative vaccines, right? And so we can't compromise on the timeline to receive it, to deliver it to the customer. And so as opposed to other goods where we might be able to change the delivery time or the modes to kind of fit our needs, aviation is critical for certain sectors.
What's the role of sustainable aviation fuel in all this? How much of a difference can it make?
A pretty significant impact, and we know that because no one's going to stop using air to move goods. We need it for, high value, highly perishable goods for reaching market on time. That's not going to go away. And so once we have to understand that we're still working within the bounds of traditional supply chains, that we need to move goods around in a expedient way, sustainable aviation fuels being one solution of a suite of solutions, and how we actually scale that and actually transition away from fossil fuel based aviation fuel can certainly be one key solution in reducing the overall emission of aviation.
So when it comes to making aviation sustainable, explain the difference between a carbon offset and a carbon inset.
Carbon offsets would be accounting for the impact of whether that be your goods movement or whatever kind of level of unit of impact you're trying to mitigate, and purchasing the environmental attributes of a project in another part of the world to actually take the environmental attributes and kind of mitigate your impact of your industrial emissions. A new approach that is becoming more common is a carbon inset. So instead of purchasing those offsets in other parts of the world, would be insetting that within the actual production of SAF and the use of SAF in the supply chain. So that change is one, upgrading the industry, keeping it within the value chain and creating those collaborative opportunities. I think that's another differentiator, which is it's looking at fuel providers working with carriers and scaling the use of SAF.
So what would carbon insetting look like for the aviation industry?
That is the question that we're working to refine, which is sustainable aviation fuel is one solution to reduce the overall impact of aviation. We know that this needs to be addressed, and SAF is one solution. But certainly right now it's not really economically viable, nor has really a great pathway for scaling. And so how can we use the value for something that we might have bought carbon offsets for, where that would be going to some other exercise in another part of the world? How can we use that investment and reinvest it to actually pay for the kind of premium of SAF and reinvest that value from the offsets that would have been historically somewhere else into aviation.
So what does this mean for logistics service providers? Will they soon be competing on sustainability?
In sort of a busy marketplace, and when you're competing, that can be a differentiator, particularly as there's a greater requirement from shippers to really understand, what does their logistics network look like? What is the overall impact? How can we account for it? How can we show reduction over in time?
What gives you optimism?
People are looking us up and calling us up and saying, help us answer the hard problems, whereas historically they didn't even want to talk about it. So that, optimism, sort of that I've had over time is just kind of continuing on that trajectory, because there's people ready to tackle the hard challenges where they were afraid to ask the questions, a decade ago.
Thank you, Alexis.
Thank you, Joe.